President Vladimir Putin has threatened to use Russia's nuclear arsenal in case Europe thinks of sending in troops into Ukraine.
Заговорили о возможности отправки на Украину натовских военных контингентов. Но мы помним судьбу тех, кто направлял когда-то свои контингенты на территорию нашей страны. Но теперь последствия для возможных интервентов будут гораздо более трагичны. У нас тоже есть оружие, да знают об этом, сейчас только я сказал, тоже есть оружие, которое может поражать цели на их территории. И что все они придумывают сейчас, чем пугают весь мир, что все это реально грозит конфликтом с использованием ядерного оружия, а значит уничтожением цивилизации. Они чего, этого не понимают, что ли?
This is not the first time that he's rattled the nuclear sabre. He has done so 3 times in the past 2 years since this war began. Once at the outset of the war against Ukraine 2 years ago, once when he was losing ground in October 2022, and once again last week as he senses that battlefield victory might be near. On Crux Decode, what is the purpose of all this nuclear saber rattling? Is there a method to Putin's provocative comments? Or does it simply achieve his objective of showing up the West and stopping them from some major intervention in the war in Ukraine? The nuclear saber rattling has almost always served the same basic purpose. Putin knows that the one thing his opponents fear the most is this, the escalation of the conflict. Even bluster about going nuclear serves as a reminder to Putin's enemies about the dangers of pushing him too far. But his equivalent of what was a State of the Union speech that happened last week also contained some distinct new elements. He not only signaled that he was doubling down on the war in Ukraine, he also made it clear that he had no intention whatsoever of renegotiating the last major arms control treaty with the United States. That treaty is also known as START, or the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. It runs out in less than 2 years by 2026. Now, some would call this a nuclear chess game, others nuclear blackmail. Implicit in Vladimir Putin's insistence that nuclear controls be gone and the continued existence of the Ukrainian state, those two issues are not separate, they must be discussed together. This is in keeping with the hypotheses that the Russian leader would be happy to see all the current limits on nuclear weapons to expire. What that would do is, it would free him and Russia to deploy as many nuclear weapons as Putin wants. While Putin said that he had no interest in pursuing another arms race, which of course, if you remember, the first arms race really drove the Soviet Union bankrupt, the implication of his statement is that the United States and Russia could possibly return to the worst days of the Cold War if that agreement is not renewed. Putin also underscored one of the distinctive and most unsettling aspects of this war in Ukraine. Time and again, Russia's senior military officials have discussed the deployment of nuclear weapons as the logical next step if, conventionally, they are not able to defeat Ukraine on the battlefield, or consequently, if they need to scare off a major Western intervention. That strategy is consistent with the Russian military doctrine as well. In the early days of the war in Ukraine, it clearly spooked the Biden administration. They hesitated in providing long-range missiles, tanks, and fighter jets to Ukraine. The fear in the White House that this would provoke a nuclear response, or at least even lead Russia to strike beyond the borders of Ukraine into proper NATO territory, that stopped the White House from delivering these high-tech weaponry to Ukraine. But whenever the Russian leader invokes his nuclear powers, it always touches off a wave of fear that if he's pushed too far, he might actually seek to demonstrate Russia's willingness to set off a weapon. Now, this is just to get his adversaries to back off, even if it is tested, let's say, in a remote location. So in this environment, Putin might once again engage in nuclear saber rattling, and it would be foolish to dismiss the escalatory risks therein entirely. This is what William Burns, who's the current CIA director and a former US ambassador to Russia, wrote in an article last month. But Putin's comments have got a more immediate provocation as well. Last week, French President Emmanuel Macron said that Europe should not rule out the possibility of sending European soldiers into Ukraine to fight the war there.
Il n'y a pas de consensus aujourd'hui pour envoyer de manière officielle, assumée et endosser des troupes au sol, mais en dynamique, rien ne doit être exclu. Nous ferons tout ce qu'il faut pour que la Russie ne puisse pas gagner cette guerre.
For an embattled leader who longs for Europe to return its glorious military days of the past, this was a typical Macron statement. After all, in 2019, he had described NATO as suffering from brain damage. Last year, he warned Europe against becoming America's strategic vassal. But Macron's latest comments may have done more to illustrate divisions within the Western Bloc and the limits of how far NATO allies are willing to go to defend Ukraine. Macron's comments were immediately dismissed by the United States, Germany, and other NATO allies, exposing a deep division in NATO on the question of sending troops into Ukraine. And this is perhaps why Putin sensed that this was the perfect time to test the depth of the Western alliance. Former President of the United States, Donald Trump, he had recently declared that Russia could do whatever the hell they want. That resonated deeply across Europe, including at the Munich Security Conference last month.
The Secretary General Stoltenberg, well, I don't know if he is anymore, but he was my biggest fan. He said all these presidents came in, they'd make a speech, they'd leave, and that was it. And they all owed money, and they wouldn't pay it. I came in, I made a speech, and I said, you got to pay up. They asked me that question. One of the presidents of a big country stood up and said, well, sir, if we don't pay and we're attacked by Russia, will you protect us? I said, you didn't pay? You're delinquent? He said, yes, let's say that happened. No, I would not protect you. In fact, I would encourage them to do whatever the hell they want. You got to pay. You got to pay your bills. And the money came flowing in.
And so has the fact that the US Congress so far not ratified a $60 billion aid package to Ukraine. Republicans in the House of Representatives have held up that bill, reportedly upon instructions from Donald Trump. The Russian leader may have also been responding to speculation that the United States, concerned that Ukraine is on a path towards losing, may provide longer-range missiles to Kyiv. Alternatively, America could also end the long-frozen $300 billion in Russian assets, which are now sitting with Western banks, and then decide to hand that over to Ukraine to purchase more weapons. So Putin's message was very clear. He regards victory in Ukraine as almost an existential struggle. It is central to his grander plan of restoring the glory of the old Russian Empire as it was in the days of Peter the Great. And once a fight is framed as a war of survival and not a war of choice, then the leap from conventional weapons to nuclear is indeed a small one. And it's that leap which Putin has threatened to make ever so often since the start of this war.